Welcome to Cedar Lane United Methodist Church. As Danny just told you, this Sunday we're going to do something a little different. Last Sunday was the 250th anniversary of the first time the song Amazing Grace was sung in a Sunday church service. We didn't have Sunday school last week, so this Sunday, January the 8th, 2023, we're going to devote our lesson to the history of the song and to the lives of the people surrounding its creation and development. From that first singing 250 years ago until today. The song Amazing Grace is a teaching tool. It's like a textbook. As Christians, we are disciples of Jesus Christ. The word disciple means student. So we're supposed to be students. Today, we often think about teachers and students learning in a classroom. Kind of like what we're doing today. And that's an important way of learning. But as students of Jesus, we're involved in far more varied and active kinds of learning. We often learn through one-on-one relationships where we do things with others. Just like doctors learn through their residencies and plumbers learn through apprenticeships. We also learn by observation and imitation in the same way young children learn their first language. We watch what the disciples do and imitate their behavior. The Apostle Paul told us to learn by imitation at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he said, "Follow me as I follow the example of Christ." As disciples responsible for making other disciples, we have to give people examples they can imitate. Most importantly, we have to be examples they can imitate. If we can't do that, we won't be very effective at disciple making. If we really want to be Christ's students, we need to think outside the box about how we learn. And one way we can learn that we've often neglected is looking at examples of discipleship throughout history. And that's what I want to do today. I want to use the example of the hymn Amazing Grace to show God's grace in action. And I want to use it to provide you with some examples that we all can imitate. Most of us are familiar with the hymn Amazing Grace, written by the Anglican clergyman and former slaver John Newton. And he was an acquaintance of John Wesley. He's part, in a way, of our Methodist tradition, although he was an Anglican priest, as John Wesley was. As we learned when we studied John the Baptist a few weeks ago, the name John means God is gracious. Grace was a major theme in the lives of both John Newton and John Wesley. The song Amazing Grace is an autobiographical account of Newton's own spiritual life. And over the last 2.5 centuries, both the song and the man who wrote it have provided all of Christendom with powerful and inspirational examples of God's grace in action, both for individual renewal and for the broader social transformation. You know, we're to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's our mission as Methodists. This is an example where change in one person's individual life produce big changes throughout the whole planet. Consider the first stanza of Newton's famous hymn. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. The lyrics of Newton's hymn are a personal testimony of the transforming power of God's grace. In the first verse of the song, Newton recalls hearing the good news of God's grace and redemption. He says, the sweet sound of this gospel message drew him toward salvation. As he accepted God's gracious gift of new life, his eyes were opened to see spiritual reality. He said he had been blind, but now he could see. With this new awareness of God's presence, his life became increasingly grounded in spiritual truth. And he became part of something larger than himself. He said he'd been isolated and lost, but now he'd been found. He knew where he belonged. He'd been found by God and by God's people. In subsequent verses, Newton continues the story of his spiritual journey. If you notice, Newton wrote the song in the first person point of view, using words like I and me. The one exception to this personal testimony of faith is the stanza that begins, when we've been there 10,000 years. Newton didn't write that verse. It was appended to the song in 1852 by the abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe in her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. During the early 1900s, a version of the song that included this added verse was published in popular church hymnals by Edwin O. Excel, making it a standard part of the hymn. The stanza added by Stowe marked an abrupt transition in the point of view of the lyrics, from I and me to we, as well as in the broader story of the song's evolution. In the decades following Newton's death, the song took on a life of its own, particularly in pre-Civil War America. And without its further development in America, it would never have had the impact that it did. A major part of the song's growth in popularity had to do with the tune, as well as the words. Newton originally wrote the song without any particular music, in a poetic meter that is now known as the common meter. As a result, many old and modern tunes will work with the words of Amazing Grace. From the Appalachian folk tune turned popular rock song, House of the Rising Sun, to Isaac Watts' famous Christmas carol, Joy to the World, sung with some repetition of the words in the refrain, to the theme of the 1960s TV comedy, Gilligan's Island. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Was blind, but now I see. That was pretty bad, wasn't it? None of these other tunes, along with many other common melodies I failed to mention, express the words of Amazing Grace as effectively as the New Britain tune that now makes the song so recognizable around the world. The origin of the tune is unknown, but many now believe it originated in the plantation culture of the antebellum South from descendants of slaves transported to America aboard ships similar to those John Newton commanded. One point people make to support this position is that the tune's pentatonic scale, you can play it only on the black notes, is a very common scale in black spirituals. But it's also common in Appalachian folk music. Another piece of evidence is the history of the song's growth and dissemination in the American South. Both of these streams of evidence support the idea that at a minimum, the song we know today was strongly influenced by Black culture. The first documented combination of Amazing Grace with the New Britain tune occurred in South Carolina in 1835. A songbook entitled Southern Harmony and Musical Companion was published that year by William Singing Billy Walker. The melody in Walker's songbook was an amalgamation of two other tunes published in 1829 by students at Center College in Danville, Kentucky. The composers of those melodies were anonymous, suggesting that the New Britain tune had its origins in the oral traditions of the antebellum South. The life of Amazing Grace has many similar characteristics to the grace-filled life of the original author, John Newton. Both the author's story and the song he wrote continue to reach out to people from different backgrounds and faith traditions, bringing them together within a fellowship of gratitude for the good things God has done. Newton's whole life was a story of transformative grace, overcoming brokenness and despair. Just before Newton turned 7 years old, his mother, Elizabeth Scatliff Newton, died of tuberculosis. Up to her death, she had devoted herself almost entirely to the education and religious training of her young son. Newton's father, a merchant Navy ship captain also named John Newton, was away at sea at the time. And when he returned home, the senior Newton quickly remarried and sent his young son off to boarding school. The younger Newton rebelled, and at age 11, his father took him off to sea. For much of his youth, Newton served with his father on 6 different siege voyages until his father retired. For a time, the younger Newton continued in the merchant Navy after his father's retirement. But he was eventually forced against his will into the Royal Navy by a press gang. You know, press gangs were part of what caused the War of 1812. During this time, Newton fell into the worst kind of debauchery. He mocked God. He used to call himself an old blasphemer. In his old age, he called himself an old blasphemer. He mocked God, and his language was so bad it revulsed even his fellow sailors. He also rebelled against Navy discipline and deserted. He was caught. And after flogging and demotion in rank, he was discharged from the Royal Navy onto a slave ship. Shortly thereafter, he was enslaved himself for about a year to a plantation off the west coast of Africa. This is something I learned. He hadn't just been a slaver, he had been a slave. During his time on this plantation, he was often starving, dressed in rags, and shackled in chains. But ironically, despite all these hardships he endured, he failed to see the evil inherent in slavery. Our prejudices can blind us to things right in front of our eyes. He was sold to another master and began to work for this new owner as a slaver, enslaving other people. He was a slave enslaving other people. His life became more comfortable, but he was still not truly free. Early in 1748, shortly after Newton was rescued from his life in Africa by friends of his father, he headed back to England on a ship called the Greyhound. He was almost 23 years old at the time. Off the coast of Ireland, the ship ran into a horrific storm that went on for days. For a while, it looked like the ship might sink. And in those days, if it did sink, everyone would die. Fearing his own death, he gave his life to Christ and felt a sense of redemption after the ship eventually reached port. By the time he reached England, Newton had converted to Christianity. For the rest of his life, he marked March 21st, 1748, or March 10th by other accounts using a different calendar, as the date of his conversion. This experience of fear and deliverance from fear was summarized in his famous hymn with the words, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed." Newton was talking about the prevenient and justifying grace of God in the second stanza of his hymn. He says that he learned to fear, and then he was freed from fear. Before his first conscious experience of God's justifying grace, Newton was taught to fear sin through a work of prevenient grace, a term Wesley used for grace preceding conversion. God's Spirit drew Newton to himself, using Newton's own inner sense of right and wrong, some of which he had obtained as a small child through the tutelage of his mother. During the storm off the coast of Ireland, God used that inner moral compass to bring a rebellious Newton to a turning point. Then at the point of conversion, God relieved Newton's fears through a work of justifying grace. Newton experienced forgiveness and redemption. But his life didn't change overnight. Some types of behavior, such as his use of foul language, started to improve real quickly. But he continued to struggle with other aspects of his old lifestyle for quite some time. Perhaps even more problematical were the sins that Newton thought were virtues. The most important of these was his career as a slaver. He pursued a career in the slave trade for several more years after his conversion. In fact, he rejoiced in that career because it gave him the financial resources to marry the love of his life. 2 years after his conversion in 1750, Newton married his childhood sweetheart, Mary Catlett, who he called Polly. To support his new wife, he continued with his plan of going to sea on slaving ships. Initially as first mate, and then later as a ship's captain. These trips were filled with dangers. Enslaving hundreds of people is dangerous business. And he dreaded his separations from Polly. He even said he felt like a jailer. But he still thought he was pursuing an honorable career. It is seldom emphasized, but Newton became a captain of a slaving ship only after his conversion to Christianity. Like so many of us, and I think this is one of the lessons of Newton's story. During Newton's early life as a Christian, his life was full of contradictions that he did not fully appreciate. For example, as a slave ship captain, Newton held Sunday worship services for his crew. But at the same time, he ordered the torture of helpless captives with thumb screws and neck irons. When Newton later wrote in his famous hymn that he had been a wretch, he wasn't overstating his transgressions in any way. He had been a wretch. Then in 1754, Newton suffered a stroke, or possibly an epileptic seizure, that forced him to retire from the slave trade. He did not initially change his career because of any moral scruples. But later in life, he came to view this event as a work of grace. It took many years for God to transform Newton's attitude toward slavery. But Newton eventually worked to abolish it. In 1788, he wrote a 50-page booklet entitled Thoughts on the African Slave Trade, which provided a frank description of the evils of slavery, founded on his own personal experience as both a slaver and a slave. Prior to writing that booklet, Newton had become the mentor of William Wilberforce. I think you said you had heard about him before. Wilberforce was the evangelical politician who devoted his life to the elimination of slavery. In December 1785, shortly after Wilberforce committed his life to Christ, the young politician sought out a meeting with his childhood acquaintance, John Newton. Wilberforce's family had kept him away from Newton for many years, fearing that Wilberforce would turn Methodist if he consorted too closely with evangelicals. The reason for the meeting between the two men was simple. Wilberforce wanted to know if he needed to give up his career in politics and join the clergy in order to serve God. Wilberforce's close friend, William Pitt, who was at the time, I think he was the youngest prime minister ever in England, had argued to Wilberforce that God could make better use of him in Parliament instead of behind a pulpit. And to Wilberforce's surprise, his old mentor, John Newton, told him the same thing. The conversations with both Pitt and Newton gave Wilberforce the confidence he needed to chart his course. Sometime later, Wilberforce noted in his journal, God Almighty has set before me two great objects: the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. By manners, Wilberforce meant morals. He was thinking about accepted cultural norms that led to all kinds of social ills, such as poverty, disease, crime, lack of education, child labor, and the decline of religious faith. During those years, England was still in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and it was full of social inequities and injustice. At the time, substantial progress on either of Wilberforce's two great objects seemed like a pipe dream. But by the grace of God, he made significant strides in both of those two great objects before his death. Newton lived to see a lot of that progress. Before Newton's death, and largely thanks to Wilberforce's leadership, Newton saw the slave trade outlawed in England and throughout the British Empire. As an interesting aside, and I find this very interesting, William Wilberforce was encouraged by John Wesley as well as by John Newton. The very last letter that John Wesley ever wrote was to William Wilberforce. On February 24th, 1791, just 1 week before Wesley's death, Wesley wrote to Wilberforce about ending the slave trade. Speaking about Wilberforce's efforts, Wesley wrote, "Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be with you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary in well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, until even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it." And that's some of the last words John Wesley ever wrote. Many years later, and just 3 days before William Wilberforce died, slavery itself was outlawed throughout the British Empire. When the Slavery Abolition Act became law in 1833, about 800,000 human beings were freed from the horrors of that evil institution throughout the British Empire without having to resort to the kind of destructive and brutal civil war that America had to endure. I call that transformation of the world. It took many decades and the dedication of many, many people to bring about these momentous changes. But big changes sometimes have small beginnings. Some of the seeds of these accomplishments were planted much earlier in John Newton's life, shortly before he left his career as a slave ship captain, or shortly after he left his career as a slave ship captain. After his stroke in 1754, Newton began training for the ministry, doing so in obedience to his mother's desires and his own sense of calling. It was during this time that he became acquainted with George Whitefield, a well-known evangelist who was one of the chief movers of the First Great Awakening, and John Wesley, who started the Methodist movement. 10 years after his stroke, Newton became an ordained minister in the Anglican Church at the age of 39. This set the stage for Newton's influence on Wilberforce, and it also led to the writing of Newton's famous hymn. Several years later, in 1772, Newton was pastoring a church located in Olney, Buckinghamshire, in the southern part of England, northwest of London and southeast of Birmingham. He wanted to write a hymn for a New Year's Day sermon on January 1st, 1773, 250 years ago last Sunday. Newton's text for the day came from 1 Chronicles chapter 17. which is basically a repetition of 2 Samuel chapter 7. In both those chapters, God promises David that his throne and royal line would be established forever, a promise that was ultimately fulfilled through the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In response to this promise from God, King David says to God, "Who am I, Lord God, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?" See 1 Chronicles 17, verse 16, and 2 Samuel 7, verse 18. On that New Year's Day, 250 years ago, in 1773, Newton could look back on almost 25 years since his conversion and echo the sentiments of King David. He was a very different man from the one he had been on the deck of the Greyhound when he accepted Christ in 1748. He'd come a long way, like David had. And he wrote the hymn, Amazing Grace, for that Sunday service. In one of the stanzas, he talks about the sanctifying grace of God. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. His grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Newton could see all the changes that God's grace had made in his life. And those changes gave him confidence that God would eventually bring him into perfect union with himself. You know, when we talk about security of the believer, in an emotional sense, a lot of that security comes from experiencing God changing our lives right now. We know that he can, if he brought us this far, he can take us the rest of the way. Long after his death, Newton was quoted in an 1856 publication called The Christian Pioneer. Here's what he was quoted as saying: "I'm not what I ought to be. Oh, how imperfect and deficient. I'm not what I wish to be. I abhor what is evil, and I would cleave to what is good. I'm not what I hope to be. Soon, soon, I shall put off mortality, and with mortality all sin and imperfection. Yet, though I am not what I ought to be, nor what I wish to be, nor what I hope to be, I can truly say, by God's grace, I am not what I once was. A slave to sin and Satan. And I can hardly join with the apostle and acknowledge, by the grace of God, I am what I am." Many of us can join with Newton in saying that we've not arrived at our goal. We are not what we ought to be, wish to be, or hope to be. But by God's grace, we're not what we once were. Imperfect as we are, God's grace has put us on a pathway to perfect love. And so we can join with the Apostle Paul in saying, "Follow us as we follow Christ." The next time you sing Amazing Grace, think about the story behind the song. As United Methodists, our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The song Amazing Grace is a story about the transformation of the world that starts in a single human heart. That's how transformation really takes place in the real world. God changed John Newton's life And he also changed the lives of John Wesley and William Wilberforce through those men and through women like Harriet Beecher Stowe. God eliminated the blight of legally sanctioned slavery throughout much of the world. And he also instituted all kinds of reforms that reduced the human suffering associated with the Industrial Revolution. We can do the same thing today. But it all starts with changes in our minds and hearts as we experience God's presence and his loving grace in our lives. God's grace is truly amazing. It is amazing. And it's transformative. And it's something that people all over the world have celebrated for 250 years using John Newton's famous song. I can truly join with John Newton and say, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. That's it.